Welcome, listeners, to another edition of Film Swap, the podcast for the adventurous film lover, as we've said in our marketing gumph. And what better person to go on an adventure with than my great friend, that fabulous facilitator of the factoid, the ecstatic gaucho himself, Mr. Jonathan Pritchard Barrett. Jonathan, how are you doing?
Cheers. Not bad, thank you.
Today, we are talking about cinematic substance abuse.
Yes, we have a theme.
Yes, this is our first themed edition, which is kind of our sort of plan going forward. And we're going to be talking today about films around the theme of substance abuse. And I think we've picked a couple of really, really good films to talk about today.
Absolutely. They're great films, both of them.
We were quite fascinated by the statistics. You get these analytics that tell you a little bit about how your engagement from an audience and who's listening and how many and what have you. And we were quite fascinated to learn that 100% of our listenership were females between the ages of 35 and 49. So now, how accurate that statistic actually is, I'm not entirely sure, but
I have
it
a
was
feeling
certainly...
Podcast analytics has a way to go.
Well, perhaps we maybe just don't have enough quite yet to really get an accurate picture there. But it was an interesting bit of information nonetheless. And so for all you ladies out there, welcome. And we hope you've come back for some more, because we're going to be talking about some really great films today.
Yes.
So I guess, shall we get right into it, Jono? Because
Absolutely.
our theme today...
Let's kick off.
Our theme today is about substance abuse. That is what we've chosen to talk about today. And we've got a couple of really good films. Of course, we're addicts ourselves, aren't we, Jonathan? We're addicts of a different kind because we're kind of film addicts, aren't we?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully slightly less bad for your health.
Yes, possibly. Although, the fact that I'm wearing glasses now and all that kind of stuff, like perhaps maybe the many hours staring at screens and things probably hasn't necessarily done me any favors, but who knows? Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the month of January, you traditionally, I've known you for many years, and traditionally in January you have what you call a dry January, don't you?
I do. I've been doing it for about, I think, 17 years now, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, so before Dry January came along, I got the idea from one of my colleagues who used to do a Dry December, but I thought that was just a bit, asking too much. So I thought I could manage January, and then since then, Dry January's become a thing, as I say.
It's a tradition. It's a tradition.
Now it's a tradition, and in fact, that slightly relates to our first film.
It does. Although I would just like to point out that probably because we started this podcast in January during your dry January, so I'm not sure that was probably the optimum conditions to start a podcast, is being completely and utterly sober. But
that's true. But this episode, shall we mention what the film is? The second film, the first film, your film?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'll introduce this one because I was the one who put this one forward. Now, when we agreed on the theme, I had a thought. I did mull over several films which I considered about putting forward, but in the end, I thought this one was such a great film. And it's interestingly a recent film. So any of those ladies out there from between the ages of 35 and 49 who might have been concerned after listening to our first episode that we were only going to talk about old fogey, scratchy old films of yesteryear, I'm happy to say that my choice for film this time around is a brand new spanking, sparkly film that's only just come out in within the last couple of years. It still has that fresh carpet smell, and so it's very new and very relevant. I think it's the 2020 film called Another Round, and it stars the great Mad Mikkelsen. I always worry that I'm saying
He's
his.
not mad. He's Mads. Mads.
He's Mads. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
not
Yes, he's
twice
a
as mad.
Danish
Plural.
actor, and I think one could make an argument, a strong argument, to say that he's probably one of the finest actors who's currently working in motion pictures. I think he's really really good, and he chooses to do some really really interesting and excellent films.
Yeah.
Um, he's worked
Also
with
in
this.
James Bond.
He was, yes. He's probably most well known as being a baddie in the first Daniel Craig James Bond movie.
Yeah.
He's the one who was giving old Daniel Craig the old, you know, deeply unpleasant torture on the old testicles there, which I think is quite a memorable scene. And he also was a baddie in one of the Marvel movies. I think Doctor Strange, wasn't it? He was the one.
Don't know that one, but I'm sure he
Oh
was.
dear. Oh well, it's a good one, and he's partly the reason why because he's. I think any time I see his name in a film, I go automatically. I go, that's going to be something worth watching
Yeah.
because he's pretty cool.
He is
And
cool.
this was directed by Thomas Vinterberg, who's a Danish director, and he's actually worked with Mads previously on a really great film called The Hunt,
I've seen that.
which
Great film.
yeah is really really excellent as well. So that's another one we would definitely recommend that listeners go and check out if you haven't seen it before.
Yeah.
But tonight we're going to talk about this. So this film is known, the international kind of English title is called Another Round, but in Danish the film is called Druk. And again, hopefully I'm pronouncing that. Listeners will have to get used to my. I'm very challenged when it comes to pronouncing uh, words in other languages. So please forgive me, any Danish listeners who might be out there. No offense intended. So this apparently translates roughly to binge drinking or
Ah.
spirits, which is kind of what the film is about. Um, so that is our first film that we are
Yes.
swapping. So, Jonathan, I throw Another Round out towards you, out in
Well,
virtual Eland, for you to
before
catch.
you sent it out, I hadn't actually heard of it. I completely passed me by, even though I'd seen The Hunt, and I remember when it came out, one of my colleagues who was a great film lover recommended it highly to me, and I went to see it and really enjoyed it. And I know all about Feston, which is his first film, which was so successful it was turned into a play as well, which was performed in London and perhaps no doubt elsewhere as well. And but anyway, this one somehow I'd missed, possibly because I think it came out during the beginning of lockdown, and so it didn't. When films, well, this sort of films basically went fut. And anyway, I completely passed me by. So I mentioned it to somebody at work who's a great fan, a great sort of cinema goer, and they said, "Oh yeah, great film." So I thought, "Oh, that's
Great.
good." So I went in with a sort of positive attitude, and well, basically, I really, really enjoyed it. It's an absolutely terrific film. Because I have my sort of pad, which I write my notes down when I'm sort of seeing a film to review it or for a podcast, perhaps. But somehow, for the first sort of 15 or so minutes, I didn't write anything down or barely anything. That's what's going on. I'm not going to have anything to say to David. That's not much good, or to our listeners. But anyway, soon enough, it sort of changed gear, and then I was scribbling stuff down like mad. And yeah, great movie, and as you say, amazing performance from Mads Mikkelsen. But I mean, the whole cast were terrific. Um, just yeah,
Well, great. Well,
terrific.
we could talk about it a bit more in depth in a few minutes. I think you touched on a really good point there about when lockdown happened in 2020. I think there's a lot of films that fell foul of that
Yeah,
particular situation
without a doubt.
because going to the cinema dried up, and I think a lot of things just ended up going straight to streaming.
Yeah,
And there was a time when, although probably people were watching more streaming and things than they would normally, I think a lot of, obviously when you're just completely saturated and constantly bombarded with media of one kind or another, it's very easy for things to slip through the cracks, slip through the net, so to speak.
yeah,
But that's one of the things about this podcast is that we're here to alert people to these things, so hopefully they can go out and investigate a little bit further if they are so inclined.
yeah. Well, with me this time.
Fantastic. So go on, Jonathan, hit me with your swab.
So the film I'm going to give you, David, is Drugstore Cowboy, directed by uh, Gus Van Sant, which came out in 1989. So not exactly a recent film, but it's not as old as She Wore a Yellow Ribbon or Cairo Stations. And it stars Matt Dillon. What did you think of that, David?
Well, you know what? Interestingly, Drugstore Cowboy is a film that I had seen previously, probably back in 1989 or around 1990 when it was kind of a new film.
Yeah,
So I had seen it, but obviously because it had been many years, like what, we're talking about like 30 years now,
yeah,
it was something I hadn't gone back to since, and I must admit, I had only really vague recollections of it. I remembered it being a good film and enjoying it at the time, but I didn't really remember it very well.
yeah,
So I was really glad that you suggested this as your selection this time because it was nice to go back and revisit it, and it was kind of like seeing it for new because I really didn't remember it very well at all. Matt Dillon, amazing. He's a very talented guy, and it's quite extraordinary that I don't know if you've seen him recently, but he looks exactly the same as he did in this film and any of the films that he ever did previously. I
yeah,
don't know what's going on there. I wish I knew his secret. But the man quite literally just has not changed physically whatsoever in all that time. That might be a slight exaggeration because I haven't really looked at him that closely, but that's my perception anyway.
yes. Not only that, but I would say that he possibly hasn't fulfilled the potential that he has that we
Hmm.
would have seen back then. I mean, obviously a very uh, well, great performer, but somehow we haven't seen that many sort of Matt Dillon films in the last 30 years, have we?
Well, I think that's an interesting point actually, because I thought of that too when I was kind of sort of reading up a bit on the film afterwards. The thing is with Matt Dillon is I think he's someone who he chooses his films. I think not necessarily he doesn't really go for really big commercial projects. He hasn't gone out there and really sort of been in the big blockbuster kind of films.
Yeah,
He's one of those guys. He just seems to pick films that I guess for whatever reason he takes an interest in, and a lot of good quality films.
yeah,
But he hasn't really sort of popped up in a lot of big headlining roles in big sort of action films and things like
no,
that, which a lot of actors do, like more commercial sort of projects and things
yeah.
to kind of put the bread and butter on the table. So, and obviously he's someone who doesn't eat a lot of bread and butter because
He doesn't look any different than he did when he was 26.
yes, he's aged quite well. So the thing is, I think maybe that's just it. I mean, I would liken him a lot to what's that Irish chap's name? Colin Farrell,
Oh, yeah,
who's another one who doesn't really, although he's made a few attempts at sort of big commercial films and stuff, but he seems to gravitate towards smaller films and better, kind of more interesting roles
yeah,
rather than sort of chasing after big hit
yeah,
films like Tom Cruise kind of films and stuff like that. So
yeah.
I kind of liken him to that, really, and I think that's one of the reasons why Matt Dillon's never. He kind of just pops up every once in a while, doesn't he?
He does. He was in There's Something About Mary,
He was,
which
yeah,
was pretty
that's
big.
true. That's true. That's
That
true.
was 20 years ago now, I
But it
suppose.
wasn't a lead role, was it? He was kind of like a sort of a supporting character in it, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's
So,
true. That's true.
yeah. So I mean, I don't know, but I mean, obviously, who knows? But the choices everybody makes and where they end up. But he's still out there and he's still working. I mean, quite recently, didn't he do a Lars von Trier film? Didn't he? The
Oh, did he?
House that Jack built. This was the last thing I remember him sort of showing
Okay.
up in, which I haven't seen yet actually. So
I
maybe
haven't seen
we'll
it.
swap it at
So
some
he has
point in
that
the future.
in there. He has a connection to Another Round because both Thomas Vinterberg and Lars von Trier, two signatories to the Dogme '95, um, whatever it was, sort of method.
Well, it was a dogma. It was like sort
Dogma,
of a
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting connection. So there is a fine thread of connective tissue between these two films. So
Yeah.
that's pretty cool as well.
I didn't know that.
So we're gonna go and grab our 6 packs, hop in the back of the
Oh yeah.
pickup truck, and drive down the 23 miles down that gravel road to the old abandoned drive-in theater, where our good mate Chuck is going to throw the film reels on the projector, and we're going to spin these films and have a watch. And then we're going to come back here and we're going to share our thoughts and observations with our uh, female listeners between the ages of 35 and 49. Um,
Cheers.
so
Cheers to that.
yes, so let's hop in the pickup truck and we'll see you back here in a couple of hours.
Okay. Bye.
Okay,
We're
and we're
back.
back. We're back. I'm just going to dust myself off after, having all that dust kicked up on the gravel roads. So, Jonathan, who's going first? Am I going to go first? Another round.
I think you should go first.
Fantastic. So, another round is, as we introduced, a film about, very much about drinking. But it's an interesting film because it's a film that isn't isn't necessarily like sort of an anti-alcohol film or a pro-alcohol film or anything like that, but it really just kind of examines um, how alcohol kind of fits into our lives, really, and the you know the sort of different ways that it impacts people's lives, how people use it, and why, and how it can affect people differently. And so I think it's a really sort of thoughtful, engaging film. And the nice thing about it is it's kind of like a, in a sense, a black comedy. Really, it's kind of like done it's a drama, but it's got a lot of humor and a lot of pathos and a lot of really, it takes you really on a journey through these people's lives.
Yeah.
So
Terrific.
I'm keen to hear what you thought about it. I'm really glad it sounds like you enjoyed it. So I'm keen to hear a few of your thoughts on it, Jonathan.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I'd never heard of the film until you suggested it, despite the fact that it won the Best Foreign Language Film Oscar in 2020, I think it was. And I've seen one, at least, of the director's other films. And but yeah, it was a terrific film. As you say, it's not exactly pro or anti-alcohol. And as a friend of mine said, I saw that on Netflix. I saw it on Netflix. He said, but I didn't want to watch it because it would just be telling me I can't drink, and I didn't want that message. But that's not the message of the film. It's much more nuanced than that. It definitely addresses the sort of dangers of alcohol, as it were, but also its sort of liberating qualities as well. And yeah, it's a nuanced film, and it's, I suppose it's slightly, well, it's when it comes to alcohol or any drug, we're going to call in this we're calling alcohol here a drug, I think, for the purposes of this podcast. It's basically a sort of a device for exploring our lives, essentially. And so, what does alcohol? How can that reveal something about the way we live? And I suppose it seemed to me that it's really about looking at how we sort of live with an ordinary and maybe boring existence, and yeah, how we cope with sort of day to day humdrum life. And I think it did a very good job with that, really. Yeah, so there's basically Mads Mikkelsen is a teacher, so he's the hero of the film, and he's he and three of his friends, other teachers at sort of high school in Denmark, they decide that, or one of them has heard of some psychologist or philosopher or sort of Norwegian man who says that humans
Someone
normally,
named Finn Skardrud.
yeah, and his theory is that we should always be a little bit pissed. Essentially, we should have 0.5% alcohol in our bloodstream, which isn't exactly sozzled, but it's sort of mildly inebriated,
Yes.
and that will help us live a less inhibited life. That's really his thing. So they decide to turn this into an experiment to sort of test the good psychiatrist's theories, and but this doesn't mean a drink at night, before bed or whatever it is, with their dinner. It basically means getting up and having a sort of tall vodka, and then having more sort of dosing yourself throughout the day in order to stay sort of inebriated and sort of open to experience. And yeah, first of all, it sounds good. Maybe it feels good, but then soon enough, things sort of start to sort of slightly wobble, and things aren't quite as they'd hoped. And yeah,
Just we should point out too that he's going through a little bit of what you'd call a midlife crisis or something, isn't he?
he very
He's
much
finding
is.
himself increasingly bored and disengaged with his life. He's feeling dissatisfied and
Yeah,
sort of thinking about his some of the choices, the life choices that he's made, and he's feeling a lot of regret. And so he's not really doing his job very well, and people have started to call him out on it, and he's seems a bit estranged from his family and from his wife and his children. So that is a little bit more about the backdrop of
yeah,
how, and I think his friends are also to a greater or lesser degree maybe experiencing these same kind of feelings.
yeah,
Is that fair to say?
yeah, definitely.
So that is perhaps one of the reasons why they embrace this idea as this project that they embark on.
Yeah, basically they're going through a midlife crisis, all four of them really,
Yeah,
and they're
yeah,
sort
and
of
then there's certain varying degrees, and with obviously with whatever whatever personal things that they're going through, but they
yeah,
all sort of embrace on the night out one night when they're out, and they have a little heart to heart, and they're all sort of feeling a bit sorry for themselves, and then they kind of say, hey, let's do this. We they talk about this idea, and then they say, well, actually, let's do it, and let's find out what happens. Let's try it.
yeah.
So that's the basic sort of story, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And there's some great sort of well bits in the film. I don't know if that's the right term, but one well, and but one thing that really stands out is where they listen to Tchaikovsky, and so there's sort of one yeah part of the film, and they're sitting around, and they decide. I can't exactly remember why, but they decided to put on some Tchaikovsky. This is what they need, And
Well, I think the idea was that the musician, the particular pianist who was playing on that recording, was someone who was known to be uh, a bit of a drinker.
that's it. He
Like,
was a drinker.
I
Yes.
can't remember. I wasn't familiar with that particular pianist myself, so I'm not sure if it was a real person or you know or
That's
not.
it.
But they put his record on, and as an example, one of the chaps was making the example that this was someone who was inspired and very creative and made really incredible music, but under the influence of alcohol.
Exactly. Exactly. And so there's this lovely sort of scene where they're sort of sitting around just listening to this beautiful Tchaikovsky, and the sort of camera pans around and sort of they're all in this sort of, I suppose, meditative state, sort of half drunk, half wrapped, listening to the music. And it reminded me of a similar scene in a film called Of Gods and Men. Have you seen that?
Yes, yes.
About these sort of French monks living in Algeria, I think it is, who they know they're going to be killed the next day, and they're sort of sitting around this table, also just men sitting around a table, and the music that plays in the background is Tchaikovsky again, and it's also a sort of silent film, and yeah, it's terrific. So now this my sort of appreciation of Tchaikovsky is sort of doubled because I didn't really know much. Don't know much about classical music, but uh, that was the thing that I suppose that really introduced me to Tchaikovsky was Of Gods and Men, and now I'm thinking, right, well, I've definitely got to get into
It's
Tchaikovsky.
time to dive in. Definitely, I would concur there. Yes,
Yeah,
I'm a fan myself. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of lovely moments like that, and initially, as the men are embracing this experiment, it does have a really positive impact on their life, doesn't it? It
yeah,
shows that they do suddenly feel more confident and more engaged, and it that actually um, manifests itself amongst their students and the people around them as well. That suddenly they notice this change
yeah,
in their behavior, and they suddenly become much better at everything that they're doing.
yes,
So initially, they um, experience some positive impact from the decision to follow through with this experiment.
yeah,
So, but it's only as the story progresses, and again, we want to avoid spoilers on this show, so we're going to not go too much deeper into that. But then then depending on the individual involved, things begin to degenerate a little bit or to change amongst the men and how it impacts them in different ways.
yes, and so there's one another sort of part of the film that was is sort of a key uh, bit of the film is where they decide, and it's not giving too much of a spoiler, they decide to have a complete bender,
Yes.
basically. And it's extraordinary sort of yeah, sequence. And they really get sort of utterly sloshed. And that's sort of quite impressive because I read an interview with Thomas Vinterberg and he said there was no drinking on the set, so they were all completely sober, but they did a very convincing job of being utterly pie-eyed.
Indeed, indeed.
But according to the interview, he said they learnt a lot from watching videos on YouTube posted by very drunk people in Russia, where they can sort of well, they were basically drinking immense amounts of vodka and getting utterly sloshed, and so that was their sort of that was their inspiration for the sort of really drunk scenes, apparently.
Well, it's a fun. I mean, because that's the thing. This film, I mean, it, you think on paper, it sounds like it's about people about alcohol and stuff, and you like your friend or colleague had said that they just made assumptions that the film was like an anti. drinking film
Yeah,
or something like that. But the film is actually, in many ways, it's quite life affirming, and it's
yeah,
got a lot of really positive energy and some really funny moments and really sort of just really lovely moments all the way through it.
very
I mean,
much.
I quite like the moment when the music teacher, one of his friends is a music teacher, and he's got that lovely moment when all these kids in his class who aren't really singing very well, and he's not really particularly engaged in trying to inspire them. But he has that moment where he has this kind of epiphany of sort of this inspiration about how he can engage with them and get them to kind of feel the music. And there's that really lovely moment when they all sing in the gymnasium,
Mm,
and it's really beautiful. And it's really there's lots of nice little moments like that
yeah,
throughout the film.
yeah.
So this in no way people should not be put off by this film thinking it's some kind of preachy
It's not preachy.
anti-alcohol film at all, because it's quite life affirming, and it does um, um, examine the impacts of alcohol and how we use alcohol and what the different circumstances are, and it kind of looks at the positive social side of it as well as some of the more negative ramifications that can come from it
Yes,
potentially.
the final scene is absolutely terrific, and I was laughing out loud, but also this was sort of moments after. It's sort of, uh, I guess the very opposite. I was sort of slightly weepy as well, and not many films do you get a film where you're sort of not sure whether you're laughing or crying or it may have been that was the night I decided to finish my um, dry January, and in honor of the film, I'd had a few more drinks than I'd anticipated. But it was what an ending to a film. I think that's going to be up there with the classics, really.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, I'd like to think as the years go on, this the reputation of this film will continue to gain pace, because I think it definitely deserves it. I think that's the reason why I wanted to put it forward tonight,
Yeah,
because it is a really great film. It's really it's thoughtful, it's engaging, it's funny, it's sad, but it's not like it doesn't succumb too much to sentimentality.
no,
Everything's very honest and true and earned.
yeah,
And I think it's really a great film that people should go and seek out.
definitely.
Folks, just hit that search, because your algorithms for your Netflix profile may not present this film to
It
you
probably won't.
as an option.
It's hidden in
So
the
you need to,
depths.
to go to that search bar, type in Another Round, find this film, and give it a watch, because you'll definitely be glad that you did.
Very rewarding. So
Great.
yes,
So
second film, Drugstore Cowboy.
yeah. So was there anything about this film in particular that why you put this one forward, why you chose it?
Well, when you gave me the theme to mull over, there were a number of films that came up. I guess there's I thought possibly Train Spotting is a classic sort of example, and what's the one by the chap who did Pi? Um, anyway, that film, and also another film I quite like is Jesus' Son. Uh,
Oh, right. Oh, I'm not familiar with that one.
well, I'll come back to that later. But anyway, Drugstore Cowboy is a film I also saw a long time ago, soon after it came out, when I was quite young, and I sort of was slightly curious to sort of did it stand up after all these years? Because I remember enjoying it when it came out. What would I get out of it now that I didn't get out of it before, and vice versa? And I suppose what I got out of it before is that Matt Dillon is this super cool character, and now I got out of it that the life that these characters live is just incredibly sad, really.
Mm.
And yeah, it's a good film. And Gus Van Sant has gone on to make more good films as well. And yeah, what do you think?
Well, I really enjoyed it. And when you talk about Matt Dillon, I mean, one of the things that's quite impressive about him is he's not really like a showy actor, is he?
No,
He's not. He doesn't. He's not into the hysterics and flailing his arms about. I mean, Matt Dillon, he always plays those characters, isn't he? In quite a laid back kind of style, and he has that kind of thing that I think was just quite perfectly pitched for this film, because I think this is a film about people choosing quite deliberately a lifestyle. It's not that they aren't they have a certain, well, certainly he does anyway. He has a certain element of self-awareness about the choices that he's making and about the lifestyle choices that he's making, and it's very conscious that they choose to live like this. And what's interesting too is that they almost become like a family, don't
they
they? They're
are a
like
sort of family. Yeah,
these people who've kind of drifted together on the back of their addiction, and but they choose as a lifestyle. They don't want to work. They don't want to do anything. They want to do is get high and stay high, and they've chosen to do this by, through a life of crime,
yeah, robbing
because the story
drugstores.
is,
So this,
yeah, they're the basic storyline is that there are these two couples who work as this sort of surrogate family that just basically lead this kind of nomadic existence, going around. They kind of set up shop in a particular town, and then they just go out and rob drugstores and pharmacies and hospital drug, storage facilities and things like this, and they do this uh, so that they can get high, and that's what they do,
yep,
and that's their life. And through the course of the film, as you would expect, uh, these this activity leads to um, some tragic consequences, shall we say, without wanting to give too much of the game away. And that leads Matt Dillon's character to reevaluate this life that he's chosen,
yes,
and try and deciding to see if he can make a break from that. And of course, there are sort of uh, repercussions to that choice, but he wants to make a conscious effort to break out of this lifestyle and break out of this cycle.
yeah,
Because he spent some time in jail and then he's come out again. He hooks back up with these people. They live in this kind of hand to mouth existence for a while, and then he ends up getting in trouble again, and he kind of goes through this cycle. And he decides after one particular event that I want to break out of this. I'm going to try and get out of this.
yes,
And then the remainder of the film is kind of about his kind of struggle to try and achieve this.
yeah,
So, and I think the film it has, like I said, it has a kind of a laid back style. These people, sometimes when you see films about drug abuse or even alcohol abuse and some of the things we've talked about tonight, they tend to make it very, like I said, hysterical, and have lots of, sort of, either grime and dirt and violence and things like this, or they, have stuff like that. But this film it isn't really like that. It kind of is very much kind of um, very laid back.
yes. I would agree to an extent, but I'm not quite sure how free their choices, because they are addicted essentially, and so they're sort of impelled by the forces of addiction. And so yeah, found an article on the Guardian website saying, "Is Drugstore Cowboy the best film about addiction ever?" And I think it sort of slightly concluded it was that journalist, but I don't know. I wouldn't go that far because I haven't seen all the films on addiction or enough of them. But it's definitely compelling. And one thing that sort of struck me about the film is so I was after watching it, I decided to do again. I decided to do some research into the film, and I found that the screenplay was written by Gus Van Sant and somebody else, but it was based on a novel by a chap called James Fogle. And basically it was a sort of autobiographical, semi-autobiographical novel. And James Fogle died, I think, in 2014 in prison. And so I read his obituary on the LA Times website, and it's a very sad story. Really, he sort of was kicked out of home or left home when he was 12 because his dad beat him, and I suppose now you'd say he had ADHD or something like that. He was sort of disruptive, and he started sort of getting into sort of petty crime, going to prison, and then eventually in prison he started sort of taking drugs and also learning about how to be a criminal, really. And but then he wrote these novels, and somehow it found its way to a publisher and or an editor who sort of turned it into something sort of a bit more polished, and then it got turned into film. But the interesting thing on the LA Times was that they said um, he um, it almost turned into a sort of a career as a writer rather than a drugstore cowboy. He said, I had everything going for me um, after Drugstore Cowboy hit the movies, but it wasn't really different. I always went back to what I knew. So when he died in 2014, at the age of 75, he
Oh,
yeah, which is quite old, but he was in prison, and basically his whole life he'd never spent more than a year or two free. So he'd been sort of locked up, got out, went went back inside after robbing more pharmacies or drugstores, and just a really sad life, really. But I suppose this is a small slice of his life in his 20s when maybe things were a bit more hopeful. Um, but yeah, extraordinary story of James Fogle. And the other thing that struck me about it is that now we can look at this because although he's really a sort of addicted to opiates. He's rather than buying stuff on the street, he decides to steal it from chemists. And now we know all about the whole opioid epidemic in America. And so, in a sense, he's not after the street drugs. He's after the pharmaceutical opiates. Or
mm.
I suppose now he'd be taking opioids instead of opiates. And I guess that makes it pertinent as well. It's like a sort of a warning from the past. Watch out for the drug companies and what they're peddling. Even if you have to go and break in and get it, it might not be good.
Yeah, I mean that you're right that is an interesting angle on it because rather than being a film about the people out on the street buying the little sort of 20-pound bags of heroin or whatever,
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what the going rate is for a bag of heroin, but I'm just that's just from watching a lot of films. But these guys, yeah, they're not that, are they? They're not the ones who are like sort of meeting guys in the alleyway or,
No.
handing off things in the car park or whatever. These are guys who are going for the medical grade stuff. And
Exactly.
they don't even seem to be particular, do they? I mean, there's certain things that they're always, when they score as particular types of product, they go, oh, yes, we got some of this time.
Yeah.
But it seems to be quite arbitrary that they just kind of go in, they just grab everything and just kind of take what they can get.
Yeah.
So it's quite an interesting sort of take on that they're not even particular, or at least from my perception, they didn't seem to be that particular about what they were using. It was just sort of like, what did we get this time? And sometimes they'd score big and get some of the really good stuff, and then other times it was just like, oh, today it's just this, but whatever, let's go and get high,
Yeah,
kind of
yeah. Well, it did
thing.
seem like sometimes they could end up with sort of laxative or just
Yeah,
anything they just found in the shelves of the pharmacy or chemist. So,
yeah.
well, yeah, very sort of haphazard approach. But
But it gives it even a more kind of harrowing um, sort of a feel to it, doesn't it? Because you kind of think that it is so like Russian roulette, isn't it? By just sort of just taking whatever you can get
yes,
and just going for it. Although there is that scene because we haven't touched on the fact that William S. Burroughs is in this, isn't
yes,
he?
he
In a
is.
small role,
Yeah,
kind of as this kind of elderly figure.
yeah,
Um, Perhaps in a sense, maybe what you described as what happened to the writer as he got older.
yeah,
Maybe that was more like a kind of what he became. He was this elderly person who spent his whole life as a as an addict
yeah,
in this kind of thing. And he was very particular when Matt Dillon gives him a present of a bag of stuff that's been given to him after he's trying to go clean. And he says, "Well, I don't want this," but he gives it as a gift to this old man. And he just kind of goes, "Oh, and I never touch that stuff. Oh, but this is nice. I'll
mm,
have this."
mm.
So he's a bit more particular than they were.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I thought about Burroughs is that he sort of brings a slightly political, bit more of a political edge to it.
He does, yeah. He has a really great speech where he talks about how he sees the use of the war on drugs as a political tool.
Yeah, exactly. Partly the war on drugs being a political tool, which is interesting, but also the fact that one of the things he says is if sort of basically if you're telling a story about drugs, it can't be positive. It has to be a sort of a bad sort of story with a sort of unhappy, a tragedy essentially.
Mm,
Which brings us back to the first film, which is a bit more nuanced as well. So he's sort of
mm,
obviously he's talking about the sort of downsides of these things, but
mm,
he is not going to shy away from the fact that that you can be have positive effects as well.
mm.
And so that's I think that's a sort of point of view that they both have, both films. Although I'd say that probably Drugstore Cowboy is a little bit bleaker um, on the
And I think because of the comment you made about the author, and I mean I think that's quite sad when you say that even after he had some success, if you will, as a writer. I mean, I don't know how popular the actual
Well, I don't
original
think any of his
novels
books have
were.
been published apart from Drugstore Cowboy. I think the rest
Uh,
of them, according to his Wikipedia page, he wrote a number of others, but I don't think they're actually published as far as I could figure out.
uh,
Yeah.
well, it's quite sad because I know, again, without getting into the spoilers, but it's sad to hear that if he returned back into that cycle,
Hmm.
because the film, I think, tries to leave it a bit more open to
Very much, yeah.
interpretation about the chances of success or whether there is success or failure there in his attempts to break out of this cycle.
Yes.
And like you say, I mean, not to downplay it, because it is true that when you're addicted, it is true your those compulsions and those things that hold you in sway sometimes is very very difficult to um, have a choice. You're absolutely right in
Yeah.
that.
And another thing that this theme that they both share is the sort of dealing with ordinary life. So I think Matt Dillon at one stage, his character at one stage says, "Ordinary life is a kind of drag." Um,
Yes.
and then this is when he's talking about his basically gets his job, where he's sort of, although it does seem the most pointless job in the world ever, making holes. And And then he goes, but it's kind of a drag, but ain't so bad, he says.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the sort of the point behind another round as well. It's ordinary life is kind of a drag, but in the end, we can draw the conclusion that it ain't so bad.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and I mean it's all about how people choose to cope with that. I mean, because everyone has to cope with the mundane aspects of life and having to do things that you maybe you'd rather be somewhere else and doing something else, but everyone's got to earn a living and they've got to cope with dealing with other people and relationships and all those kind of things.
Mm.
And it's about the different mechanisms that we choose in order to try and, infest some meaning and some enjoyment and things into all that other stuff that comes with it.
Yeah.
About and that's quite interesting. I mean, I love that line in Drugstore Cowboy when he's talking to the lady when he's trying to sign up for the methadone treatment, and he's starting to make the moves to break out of his addiction,
Yeah.
and the lady's asking him questions, and he says that great. Obviously, I can't remember exactly what he says, but he says something to the effect as, "Oh, people are sometimes just trying to cope with all the things in life that are crap, like having to tie your shoes."
Yes. Yes.
And I totally obviously we all have moments like that when even just the most you know small tiny sort of everyday things like that can make you feel like, oh God, if I ever have to do this again, I'll go mad. And that so I love that little line that he says there about the tying the shoes, because it made me laugh, and it's kind of there's a nice element of truth to that, isn't there?
Definitely, yeah. That's
Yeah,
really good. The other thing that both films sort of share is this idea of sort of family, or in the first one it's sort of a brotherhood, and the second one it's more of a family, but it's a sort of some symbiotic relationship. There's four of them in both films, and yeah, uh, that's an interesting sort of uh, dynamic, I guess. Not just a couple, but two couples, perhaps.
yeah, yeah, and
A
just
couple of
the
couples.
importance that relationships, that some people are really close in with their families, and other people gravitate toward, kind of create their own sort of surrogate families, and that's what's kind of happened here,
Yeah.
because the film shows of the relationship that he has with his I think it's his mother, isn't it? I don't think there was a father in the picture there, but
Yes.
at one point there's a key scene where him and his girlfriend go essentially for help, although it's not. He doesn't really sort of portray it that way, but he's gone to his mother because they're in a bit of a crisis,
Yeah.
and he needs some clothes and things,
Yeah.
and the kind of the reception that he gets, which I mean, his mother obviously means well and things in a sense, but the way that she greets them and sort of talks to them is kind of counterproductive, isn't it?
It
And
is. I actually wrote down a little bit another line from when he goes to see his mother. His mother says to her, "You act as children who want to run and play. You can't always run and play." Great line. Great line.
mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
there's some great dialogue in this film as well.
yeah, indeed. Yeah, well, so I really enjoyed it.
Good.
And I think I really enjoyed revisiting it after many years because,
Me
like I
too.
said, I really just did not remember it really at all, except in the most vague terms.
Yeah,
And it's really nice sometimes to go back and revisit things that you haven't seen for a long time to see if they still hold up or
definitely.
if you have a different reaction. I mean, there are times I see films that I remember not liking very much.
Yeah,
And then when I revisit them, I say, well, actually, I quite got something out of that
yeah.
this time, and vice versa,
Well, one
So,
interesting thing about this film, when we turned it on, Autumn that's my wife, was watching it too, and I sort of pressed play. She said, "Drugstore Cowboy? You didn't tell me it was Drugstore Cowboy. I've seen this film 8 times."
Oh, wow.
and wrote an essay on it when she was at school. And but also like me, this was a while ago. So she sort of watched it afresh after sort of a few decades since last having seen it,
Hmm.
and but it was it's funny that I guess it's one of those films that people of a certain age will have seen a while ago,
Hmm.
and not have seen for a while. And it's interesting to go back to it and see how it measured up.
Yeah, well, that's me. Well, I would love to read that essay. You should, see if she still has it and get her to email it over to me because I would love to read that. It'd be very interesting indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see if she can find it.
Mm. Well, what do you think? Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on Drugstore Cowboy?
No, it's got a great soundtrack as well. I've probably said enough. It's a really enjoyable film. I recommend everybody go and see both these films, perhaps even sort of uh, adjacent to each other, and so they can sort of see them like we have, sort of in light of each other. And I think that adds to the depth.
Yeah, definitely. They're both, they have some sort of common threads running through them, but they also take some different kind of perspectives on things. So I think they're definitely, it would make a good double feature if anyone out there who's got that kind of time who could actually sit and watch two films
Exactly.
back to back, because I know I certainly wouldn't be able to manage that. Last time when we talked, I made a point of sort of telling our listeners where they might be, at least if they live like us in the United Kingdom, um, that where they could find the films that we're talking about. But then on reflection, I thought maybe I shouldn't spend too much time harping on that because it really depends on when people listen to the
Very
podcast.
true.
And if we, think that perhaps maybe at some point, sort of, 45 years in the future, if someone
Millennia, when
happens
people
to,
are listening
yeah,
to it.
yeah, exactly, some point in the long distant future when somebody, um, somehow excavates our server that's got our podcast recordings on them and listens back to these. Um, what a thought that is. The that they may not have the same access, that we enjoy at the moment. So, maybe at that time the technology will be as such that people might literally be able just to think and say, "Oh, Drugstore Cowboy, I'd like to watch that," and then it'll somehow be miraculously beamed into a computer chip inside their brain, and they'll, in their VR headset that's been surgically
Implanted into
attached to
their.
their heads by Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, and they'll be able to just watch it instantaneously without even sort of moving a muscle. So on that note, all we'll say is another round and Drugstore Cowboy. Use your search facilities within your streaming services of choice,
Absolutely.
or on Amazon if you're like me and you're an old school and you still watch discs, physical media. So, search out these things and go and look for them and find them because they're out there,
Yeah, terrific films, both of
and
them.
they're definitely worth uh, looking for.
Yes.
So I think on that note, do you have a quick take or anything that you'd like to give before we sign off this time, John?
No, well, I was going to say that I'm watching Happy Valley at the moment, which is the sort of BBC drama that's gripping the nation, or has gripped the nation until the sort of finale two nights ago. I'm halfway through and have enjoyed it. I mean, it's slightly schlocky, but at points, but it's generally it's enjoyable, above average, I'd say.
There's nothing wrong with a bit of schmuck nowadays. But,
No.
yeah. Well, the only because I watch lots of films and stuff, but the one that I've watched since we last spoke that really stuck out to me was a film by King Hu called Dragon Inn, which
Okay.
I watched quite maybe about a week ago.
Right.
on a Friday night. And this is King Hu's most famous film is, of course, A Touch of Zen.
Yes.
But Dragon is the film he made just when he first migrated to Taiwan. He left Hong Kong, where he was working for the Shaw Brothers, and he made quite a famous film called Come Drink With Me.
Okay.
But after he finished that, he decided that Shaw Brothers wasn't sort of giving him the creative freedom that he wanted, so he went and started his own production company in Taiwan.
Right.
And the first film that he made was called Dragon Inn, and I watched that, as I said, about a week ago, and it is absolutely immensely entertaining.
Is it?
And
I haven't seen any of
amazing.
his films. I've heard the name, but
Oh my goodness! Well,
wasn't.
Jonathan, we'll have to do perhaps in our next episode we'll do some sort of a theme so that we can tackle some King Hu because he's
Fantastic.
absolutely brilliant. If you like martial arts films, this is a great film. But even if you just like action adventure films,
Yeah.
this is a terrific film. I'll give you a really quick take on it. But it's basically there is a, a band of eunuchs who take over the Chinese government,
Wow.
and they execute a general of the army who obviously opposed them,
Yeah.
and then his children, uh, surrounded by some faithful kind of bodyguards, run off
Yeah.
into the night to escape. And these eunuchs, evil eunuch leader and his band of thugs,
Yeah.
go chasing after them, and
Wow.
that's the basic premise. But then what happens is that all both they and the evil sort of thug
Yeah.
army and this band of highly skilled warriors
Wow.
who it is not revealed kind of until more close to the end of the film who they actually are and what relevance they have to the goings on.
Yeah.
But they all converge at this inn in the middle of the kind of out in the wilderness somewhere called Dragon Inn,
Right.
at Dragon Inn Gate. And it is there that you then have this fantastic sword battles
Wow.
and martial arts things, epic battle scenes and these little sort of clever, kind of suspenseful, attempted poisonings of
Brilliant.
things inside the inn. And it is incredible, incredibly inventive, editing and amazing. This fluid camera moves
Terrific.
that just constantly, the film is just constantly in motion and full of energy and has these amazing backdrops of these mountains with the mist in the
Wow.
background while these incredible battles are going on. And it's immensely entertaining and clever and really
Sounds
enjoyable.
terrific.
And I definitely recommend if you like a good action picture. This film is definitely worth seeking out. It's called Dragon Inn, and that is kind of the best thing that I've watched in the last kind of couple of
Wow.
weeks. If you get a chance, go and search that out. And any of King Hu films actually are amazing as
Okay.
well.
Brilliant. Yeah, we'll have
Yeah.
to do that. Yeah.
I must admit, with the TV series, I tend to shy away from TV series mainly just because I don't want to make that kind of commitment
Mm.
of watching, hours and hours of different episodes
Yeah.
of shows. But as we were talking about before we came on the air, we said, because British TV series tend to be a bit more concise and they tend
Definitely
to
a
not
lot more
sort of
concise.
drag them out like the American shows that drag things out for series after series and episode after episode
Yeah.
and sort of just keep padding things out and dragging on. So that's why I tend to avoid getting into watching
Can
things.
understand that.
But some British shows they tend to just do like sort of 6 episodes,
Yeah. Yeah. Happy
and
Valley is just a mere
they
6 episodes for each series.
yeah, so that's a bit more sort of manageable, and so maybe at some point, I mean, I can't say that I would necessarily go and check that one out to be honest, but maybe someday.
Maybe. 20,000 years in the future in your VR headset. Your
Yes,
head can
exactly,
watch it.
exactly. Just a quick note that our Facebook group is live out there, and we would love for some of you ladies out there, 35 to 49, and you blokes of any age, anyone out there, if you want to come and join us, if you look on Facebook for Film Swap, the podcast,
The
we have a
podcast.
little group there. We've made it a private group so that you do have to kind of just request to join. But once you do that, we'll welcome you in unless
Definitely.
there's some indication that you're like some sort of a, Facebook maniac troll or something to that effect, whatever that might look like. I don't know. I don't really know, but anyway, we'll let you in and you can come and talk about film. We'd love to hear from you, to hear what you think about some of the things we talked about tonight, some of the films
Yep.
we talked about, and we'd also like to hear your thoughts about some other films about the subject that we talked about tonight. If you want to recommend some other
Mm.
films, and you know what might be cool is if you sent us, like if you recorded a little voice swap, and maybe we might try and sort of cut it into the show and share it on a future show.
Definitely. Absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
but one thing we definitely we'll continue to feed our addiction for great films, and when we see some particularly interesting ones, we're going to come back here and we're going to tell you all out there about it, and hope that you go and check them out as well.
Definitely.
Anyway, listeners, thank you for joining us, and
Absolutely.
we'll be back very very soon. Uh, Take
Goodbye.
care. Bye bye.
Film swap, 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 film swap.
Oh, shut your gob! You talk too much.